I first started noticing that something was wrong about 3 months ago. At the time, I was working from home and would usually light a scented candle while I worked, which usually helped me relax and stay focused on my work. I would usually burn through a candle a week, but over time, the candle started to take less time to fully burn up. At first, I thought that this was because of a change in ingredients the company that made the candles used, but the problem persisted after I switched candle brands, which I once again blamed on the candle manufacturers. I kept this belief for another week until the first incident. While getting up from my computer desk, which faces away from the candle, to take a quick bathroom break, I caught a glimpse of the lit candle. A 2-inch layer of molten wax rested on another 3-inch layer of solid wax, the wicks rising out at first and being somewhat visible through the molten layer, finally breaking the surface and being slowly burned away. The flames flickered as I swung the door open and walked out of the room. When I returned 10 minutes later, the molten layer was gone and the wicks had been shortened so that the flames rested right above the solid layer of the wax. At first, I thought that the glass jar that contained the candle was leaking, but after a short inspection, I was only able to find 2 small drops of candle wax that had solidified right next to the candle on the bedside table. I still had 2 hours of work left to do, but I was too lost in thought and was unable to do any work for the rest of the day. Every night before I go to sleep, I like to read for at least 30 minutes, and while reading, I usually light a candle. Around 4 days later, I had almost forgotten about the incident and went back to using candles. Due to my naivete, it returned. I fell asleep while reading with a candle lit on my bedside table. I woke up to loud, slurping noises. As I opened my eyes, the brightness of the light I had not turned off almost blinded me. As my eyes tried to readjust to the light and focus on what was in front of me, I saw a somewhat humanoid, dark gray to light blue blur that contrasted with the white paint on the walls behind it. Another gray line stretched from the shape's head to the candle on my bedside table. I could feel my heart skip 5 consecutive beats. I opened my mouth and tried to force out a scream for help, but the pressure I applied to my throat was way beyond what it was able to handle, leading me to only produce a light wheezing sound. I tried to sit up, or to at least prop myself up, but my muscles failed me. Trying to push myself up with my arms felt impossible. As I stared at the figure that had suddenly appeared in my room, my eyes finally managed to focus, making it possible for me to see the intruder who was now staring at me. The figure was a man, at least 7 feet tall, wearing nothing. He looked bloated. His eyes were bloodshot and looked like they would pop out of their sockets at any point. His skin was a grayish light blue. His lips extended from his mouth like an elephant's trunk, which had been split in half. The lips extended from the man's face to the candle. The flames had been put out. He was using his lips as a makeshift straw, slowly sucking up all the molten wax from the candle, which had fully liquefied while I was asleep. I laid in bed, unable to move, unable to scream for help, staring until he emptied the jar. His lips retracted back to his face, the molten wax solidifying on their tips and cracking, flakes of wax falling off the man's lips and falling to the floor. The man grinned, staring at me. The ridges and gaps between the teeth were filled in with wax, making it impossible to make out where one tooth ended and the next one began. The man opened the door he was standing next to, but instead of walking out of the room, he stepped behind it. His face peered at me from above the door, and then once again, like he had done to drink the wax, the man puckered his lips, which stretched from his mouth and floated to me. I shook and tried to roll over away from him. I wanted to get up and run, but my fear had taken over my body. Tears flowed from my eyes. He kissed me on the cheek, leaving flakes of wax and light moisture. He retracted his lips and lowered his head behind the door. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, I saw the empty glass jar, which at one point contained the candle. Even though I had hoped that what had happened was a dream, it wasn't. I still had flakes of wax on my cheek and on my bedroom floor. The wax in the jar had disappeared. I called the police, but they were unable to find anyone in my apartment. They also could not find any evidence of a break-in. After the break-in, I started looking for a new apartment to move to, thinking that the man was tied to the building I was in, but even though I had thrown out all of my candles, I could not stomach spending another hour in my apartment, constantly looking over my shoulder or walking around with my back pressed up against the wall to not allow it to creep up on me. Thankfully, my friend Emma was able to let me stay over at her apartment while I looked for a new one for myself. Me and Emma have been friends since we were 8, and we've been there to support each other when times get rough. This isn't the first time I've had to stay over at her house for an extended amount of time. In fact, I've had to stay over at Emma's as many times as she's had to stay over at my apartment, whether it was because of evictions after losing a job, breakups, or a candle wax drinking squatter. I didn't even know if it was human. I mean, sure, it looked like one, but human lips are not supposed to do what his did, and somehow it didn't have a reaction to molten wax being poured down its esophagus. I didn't tell Emma about what happened, the details at least. I just told her that a man had broken into my house and was watching me sleep. The only people I told the truth to were my therapist and the cops, and all of them disregarded what I told them as my mind making things up after a traumatic event. For a while, I believed what they said. I mean, why wouldn't I? But then I started seeing him again. For a few days, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me again like it had done during the night of the incident. For split seconds out of the corner of my eye, I would see the outline of a tall, bloated figure. At first, they were hours apart, but after a while it became constant. He was standing in each room I passed, in every single dark corner I glanced past. And then, he spoke. "Feed me." It stood in the kitchen, peering over from a small gap between the fridge and the sink, where the trash can that had been knocked over onto its side usually stood. His voice was raspy, and every word that came out of his mouth was distorted as if he were gargling water. But still, I could somehow clearly make out each word he said from over 15 feet away. "Please, just leave me alone. Why are you following me?" I shouted at the figure, the same fear that had taken over my body during the night I saw him for the first time, paralyzing me, making it impossible for me to move anything other than my eyes, eyelids, and mouth. "I'm starving. I need you to feed me," it replied again, now stepping out from behind the fridge. He stepped directly onto a rotten banana, its mushy brown contents seeping out of the peel under the pressure of his decomposing foot, which was covered in scabs and took up the same grayish light blue color as the rest of his body. He mostly looked the same. His bloodshot eyes bulged from their sockets, but now his tongue was swollen. It peeked out from between his bloated, cracked gray lips. It stared at me, waiting for an answer. "Okay, I'll feed you, but please just leave me alone," I replied, the tone of my voice shifting into high-pitched squeals with every quick breath I took. He looked satisfied by my response. He somehow squeezed his bloated body back into the gap that was at least 4 times smaller than him. After peering over at me from above the fridge, he bent over backwards, his spine releasing a series of sickening cracks until he was fully obscured by the fridge. And then he vanished. Still barely in control of my body, I limped over to the couch tucked away in the back corner of the living room. It took me at least 10 minutes to steady my breathing and 20 more to fully regain control of my body again, but as soon as I did, I ran out the house and to the nearest store. During the 15-minute walk, he stared at me through dark windows and the backs of cars, peered out at me from gaps between leaves in the trees and bushes. He even followed me into the store, staring at me from the middle of the deserted aisles before disappearing right before my eyes were able to fully catch him. Once I finally got the candles, I randomly picked 4 off the shelves and rushed to the self-checkout. When I arrived home, I had 2 hours before Emma got off work. I didn't want to feed it while she was home, and I didn't want her to see it. I pulled out 2 of the candles from the black plastic bag and placed them on the kitchen table. The first, a light blue candle named Garden Rain, and the second, a red candle named Juicy Watermelon. I pulled out a lighter from one of the drawers Emma used after her stove stopped lighting on its own and lit each of the 6 wicks on the candles. As soon as I started seeing the wax melt under the heat of the burning wicks, I dropped the lighter onto the table next to the candles and ran out of the room. I could not stomach seeing that thing again. Even just thinking about it made me shudder and hyperventilate. The paralyzing fear that seeing him caused me made me want to vomit. At least 30 minutes later, I started to hear it drink, even though the living room and the kitchen were separated by a wall. Even though I had closed the door, I could still hear what at first started as a slurping sound, which was followed up by loud gulps, and then it stopped. And once again, 30 minutes later, it started drinking. As the slurping started once again, I heard the door to the apartment crack open. It was Emma. As she stepped through the door, I saw her carrying 2 large brown paper bags of groceries in her hands. She was headed to the kitchen. "Hey, let me grab those for you," I said, running over to her, my voice shaking. "Oh, thanks. Are you okay? You look scared." My eyes shot wide open in a mixture of fear and surprise. I said the first thing that came to mind. "Yeah, just, I didn't expect you to come home so early. I got a bit spooked." "Oh, crap. Sorry, I know I should have called you. Work let me off early today." I started to turn away from her, walking to the kitchen. Trying to keep her away from the kitchen, I told her to wait for me in the living room because I wanted to talk to her about something. I didn't know what I would talk to her about, but that was a problem for future me to resolve. Somehow, it worked. "What's that sound?" she called out to me while walking towards the living room couch. It took me a few seconds to come up with an excuse. I think it's the sink. Or the pipes, at least." I opened the door to the kitchen with my eyes closed at first, hesitant to look, knowing what would be greeting me. Slowly prying my eyes open, I started to see its outline. My muscles started to lose strength as the details of the man came into my view. I felt the grocery bag start to slip from my arms. My knees buckled. Face first, I fell onto the kitchen floor, scattering the groceries all over the floor. A mixture of a light scream and a yelp escaped from my mouth as my body made contact with the floor. Emma, concerned for my safety, ran into the kitchen. She didn't scream. Using all of the strength and mobility I had in my muscles, I rolled over expecting to see her face drenched in terror, my body frozen, still unable to move, just like my body had done the first time that I saw him. But Emma looked concerned. The man was gone. She crouched down beside me. "Oh my gosh, are you okay? What happened?" I looked around, observing my surroundings. I tripped on the little thing at the bottom of the door frame. I finally managed to blurt out another excuse. Not being able to remember what the name of a door sill was, I started to sit up, using a part of the energy that had returned to my body. Pain pulsed through my chest and arms. Emma looked at me with a concerned face. "You've been acting really weird since I got home. Are you sure you're okay?" "Yeah, I think I'm just having one of those days, you know." The confusion on Emma's face said that she didn't know. And to be honest, I didn't either. I guess my luck of pulling random excuses out of my butt ran out. Emma thought that she triggered some sort of PTSD response after barging into the house unannounced, at first apologizing, then trying to change the subject to stop my trembling, which I was still unsuccessfully trying to hide from her. "Did you buy candles?" Emma asked, picking the groceries apart from the garbage that spilled out of the can that the man had knocked over, placing them on the table next to the now half-empty glass jars. The flames flickered above the inch or so of molten wax the man was unable to finish drinking. "Yeah, I've been struggling with work lately. They usually help me focus." Interesting combination you've got going on here." She looked at me and smiled slightly. I smiled back and chuckled to seem normal. Yeah, even I don't know what I was trying to accomplish here, to be honest. I tried to help Emma clean up the spilled groceries, but she did not let me. She told me that I needed to recover like I had been in a car crash instead of having taken a little tumble. After a few seconds of silence, Emma spoke again. "Anyway, what do you want to talk to me about earlier?" A quick jolt of stress shot through my body. In a jumbled mess of lies and fear, I'd forgotten what I had told Emma. I sat there in silence for a few seconds, unable to come up with an excuse. I don't remember. It wasn't anything serious, though. "Oh, dang, did you hit your head, too?" she said once again, proudly smiling at her joke. At this point, Emma picked up the last bag of potato chips from the floor and placed it on the table. And then she opened the fridge and started loading the groceries into it. Anyway, I gotta go get back to work. I blurted out after a few more seconds of awkward silence. All right, well, good luck. I walked over into the living room and sat down in front of my workstation, which now consisted of a laptop sitting on a small foldable TV tray that had just barely enough room left on it to fit a small USB mouse. The last thing I remember before I fell asleep was me mindlessly scrolling through apartment listings while Emma watched a random 90s horror movie I'm positive only had a budget of $500. I woke up with a light, stinging pain shooting through my dry throat and a dim hissing sound caused by thousands of water drops striking the ground outside filled the room. I pressed the spacebar on my laptop. The brightness of the screen blinded me temporarily. After taking a few seconds to let my eyes readjust, I managed to make out the time. 3:45 a.m. A strong smell I was unable to make out the origin of assaulted my nostrils. Lavender. The smell hitting my nose had the same effect on me that I would expect smelling salts would have on a weightlifter right before they set a world record. Before I knew it, my legs were moving on their own at an almost uncontrollable pace, fighting back against my mind, which was telling them to slow down after years of being used to navigate both mine and Emma's apartment as steadily as possible to not bother the neighbors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stood before Emma's bedroom door. A faint, yellow, pulsating light radiated from a lamp and snuck out of the small gap between the door and the doorframe. Reluctantly, I pushed my left hand up against the door, my right hand grasping onto the doorframe for a sense of stability. Once the door was fully agape, I scanned the inside of the room, my heart skipping a beat for every humanoid shadow cast up upon the wall by the lights from the wicks, which were set ablaze and were being slowly burnt away. I walked into Emma's room and made my way over to her bedside table to put out the candle. As I stepped closer towards her, her face became more defined. I could finally make out her features. She was awake, but no, she couldn't have been. Even though her eyes were wide open, they never blinked. She didn't even move slightly. As I moved closer, I finally managed to fully make out the expression of pure terror on her face, her mouth wide agape as if she was about to release a deafening screech, but she could not have. A single drop of solidified wax dribbled out the corner of her mouth and clung to her cheek. My eyes traced the cream-colored path back towards her mouth, first up her cheek, and then between the corner of her mouth, and finally, behind her teeth. There, instead of her tongue or the roof of her mouth, I saw a wall of wax which had filled the entirety of her mouth. I fell to my knees and hunched forward, supporting my body weight with my arms. I was too late. I resisted the urge to vomit and got back up onto my feet. A mixture of tears and snot slid down my face and onto my lips. Shaking now, I slowly started limping over towards my phone, which I had left on the couch next to where I had awoken just minutes before. Just minutes before my life was destroyed. Because of my lies. If I had just told Emma what I had gone through, if I had just told her what had happened on the night of the incident, which now seemed trivial. Even if she thought I was crazy, I know that she would have complied just to make me feel better. It took me at least 30 seconds of repeated attempts to stabilize my hands enough to properly dial 911. Someone broke into my apartment and hurt my friend, was the only reasonable explanation I could come up with that would not get the operator to hang up on me thinking that this was a prank call. I sat there in the living room for an agonizing 10 minutes, crying. My sadness slowly transformed into anger towards myself, and my mind raced, thinking of all the lies I'd told. I kept thinking that if I had just told her the truth, she would not have been laying there in her bed, her body bloated. Every single orifice has signs of, well, it's all been filled with candle wax. That's what was written on her autopsy report. For a few days, I was the main suspect in Emma's murder. But due to the almost unstoppable crying and the unresponsive state that I was in when the police arrived, mixed with the lack of evidence of me having a way to produce 30 pounds of candle wax, led to me being released out of police custody. But because I was the main suspect, I was not told any details about what had fully happened to Emma. For days, all I had to work off of was the image of her face, frozen in terror, and a short glance I caught of her bloated body as she was being carted away on a stretcher. I recounted every single word of our last conversations over and over again until they became permanently etched into my brain. Emma's parents originally wanted to cremate her, as this is what she had somewhat jokingly asked for whenever the topic of funerals came up. Well, she had joked about wanting to have had unpopped popcorn shoved down her throat before she was sent off to scare the crap out of the guy cremating her. But due to all the wax, which would have been impossible to get out of her body, they were forced to bury her. A few days before Emma's funeral, her body disappeared. After Emma's death, her parents took me into their home. After reading the autopsy reports and seeing her corpse, they had thrown out every single candle they owned, which made their home the safest choice I had. Still, this did not stop me from buying a machete and keeping it under my bed, just in case. I was lying on the bed in their guest room. The bedroom is right above the front porch of the house. At first, I heard them ring the doorbell, which was followed up by 3 powerful knocks on the door. For about a minute, I laid there on the bed, listening to muffled voices exchanging distorted words I was barely able to make out, which slowly transformed into disordered weeps. Curious, I lifted myself up from the bed, made my way over to the window, and carefully lifted the bottom panel, making sure not to make too much noise. The distorted, muffled sounds started forming into coherent words. We checked the security footage, but the only strange thing we could see was a 5-second time jump. One of the officers spoke in a serious and almost monotone voice, which meant that the security guard, who was the only person in the building, had to climb down 2 flights of stairs, walk through a 40-foot-long hallway, and then drag her body back upstairs and out of the building in 5 seconds. Emma's mom let out a yelp. But don't worry, ma'am, that's actually good news, because we know that her corpse is still somewhere within the building and was probably brought to the wrong floor by an intern. We've already warned all of the staff at the hospital to keep an eye out, and we also sent 5 officers to search the hospital. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My breathing quickened, but this time, instead of fear, I felt anger. That sicko stole her corpse and was probably in the weird separate plane of existence he always went back to after terrorizing me, cutting off chunks of her body, melting her, and drinking her. I closed the window. Emma's mom's cries once again turned into a muffled rumble, which was only possible to make out if you knew what to look for. I took a few steps back from the window, planning to lay back down, not wanting to bother Emma's parents. I bumped into something. Not something. Someone. Its fleshy, towering form, as solid as a wall, sent me tumbling forward. I knew it was him. He had returned to take me too, to stretch his swollen, cracked lips, push them down my esophagus, fill my lungs and stomach with wax. But despite all of that, this time I was not scared. I was angry, and I was not going to stand there in terror like I had the last time I saw him. I fell forward onto my knees, my face missing the windowsill just by mere inches. I put my hands onto the floor, lifted one of my knees, and rotated 180 degrees, now facing the monster. To the right of him, pushed up against the wall, was the bed. Light from the sun reflected off the metallic button which kept my machete in its sheath. The man started to stretch his lips. They were moving towards me, waving and wiggling through the air like a snake slithering towards me. I dove towards the bed, one of my feet pushing off of the floor and the other pushing against the wall, which creaked under the pressure applied to it. I flew for a few moments before slamming down onto the carpet and sliding forward. The heat generated by my skin and brushing against the carpet released a sharp, stinging pain throughout my body. My outstretched arm landed just a few inches short of the machete. I quickly bent my arms, pushing my body up, and crawled towards the machete. My fingers wrapped around the handle. I spun around, my back pushed up against the bedside table, once again facing the man. He was still facing the window, but his lips faced me and were just a few feet away from me for what felt like minutes, but was most likely no longer than a second. I struggled to hook my finger under the strap, securing the machete into its sheath. As the lips inched towards me, the man started producing gurgling noises. He was regurgitating wax. I finally pulled the machete out of its sheath. I swung the blade at the man's lips. The blade was not met with any resistance as it sliced through the man's lips, which landed on the carpeted floor with an audible thud. The man did not have a physical reaction to my counterattack. His lips kept creeping towards me. Once again, I slashed at the lips. Still no reaction. I repeated this at least 3 more times. I wanted to kill him. I wanted to take revenge for what he had done to Emma. But fighting back was pointless. I realized that no matter how much I tried to hurt him, I couldn't kill him. I couldn't get rid of him. My rage dissipated and a mixture of fear and sadness crept in and soon took over my body. I screamed for help. I screamed in fear, in agony. Tears streamed down my face as the man's lips finally reached my face. He wasn't met with any resistance as his lips snuck between mine, pried my jaw open, and finally started to slide down my esophagus. I heard the cops run up the stairs. They started banging on the door asking if I was okay, only to have been met with muffled screams. Hot wax started to pour down inside me. The stinging pain of the heat made me want to plunge the machete, which I had dropped onto the ground next to me, into my stomach to create a gaping wound that the wax would hopefully funnel out of. The texture of the man's slippery, oily lips matched the poison-like flavor of the wax, caused me to start gagging. I felt my insides bulging, like at any moment my intestines would have been filled to the point where they would pop. I wanted to vomit, to drain myself of the filth I was filled with, but his lips had plugged my throat, not allowing anything to get out. Hearing my muffled screams, the cops started kicking the door down, the man retracting his lips. The suction aided my attempts at cleansing my insides. I got onto my hands and knees, streams of molten wax pouring out of me, solidifying on the carpet with another loud thud. The door swung open, slamming into the wall, and the man was gone. That's the last thing I remember before I passed out. But according to one of the doctors who was in the ambulance that brought me to the hospital, I was still semi-responsive during the first 10 minutes of the ride to the hospital. Approximately 13.4 pounds of wax were removed from my body. The doctor said that I was in critical condition, and some of them did not expect me to make it. One of the officers who was there that day, the man attacked me. Took a report of what had happened to me. Due to the unmistakable evidence of what had happened to both me and Emma, the fact that this was the 3rd instance of me reporting something like this, the police finally started investigating who this man might have been. Around a month later, I was discharged from the hospital and once again have been staying in the living room. Of Emma's parents' house. I've been seeing the man again. Candles were not allowed in the hospital I stayed at, which means that he's probably very hungry. He's close to attacking me again, I know it. He wants to finish what he started, and I don't know if I have the power to fight back. I'm not sure if defeating him is even possible. I'm tired. I've been seeing Emma too. Her bloated, reanimated corpse often appears to be standing next to the man. If I let him take me, will I get to join them? I've tried asking them, but they don't answer. They just stare. I can't keep living in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder. And I miss Emma. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this narration. I just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my patrons who are subscribed over at my Patreon. We have a great big thank you from me to you, Alonzo, Kozak, Icy Narrates, Jesse Hartley, Andreas Anderson London, and Geek Sanctuary. Thank you guys so much for supporting me. If you would like to support too, just check out the links in my description. And thank you again for listening. I hope to see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.